Welcome back to our trip across America. This part of the adventure we went through just a little bit of Alabama. This is kind of an interesting thing. I've never done this before, but the tunnel for I-10 outside of Mobile, Alabama goes under the water. It's just a little under a half a mile, or excuse me, just over a half a mile long. And I have no idea how much water there is above us as we go under here. But it was different knowing that as you're driving through a tunnel, you're going underwater. First time for almost everything. We didn't do a whole lot of sightseeing in Alabama. We did go through another quilt store though. It was off to Mississippi. Our first adventure was going up to Vicksburg and checking out the battle area for the siege of Vicksburg, the Civil War siege. Vicksburg was a very strategic location on the Mississippi River that made it critical to both sides of the war. The siege of Vicksburg started May 18th and continued till July 4th of 1863. Quite a long time for that city to be under siege. Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton was in charge of the Confederates, and General Ulysses S. Grant was in charge of the Federals. With General Grant's victory here and the victory at Gettysburg just one day before, the Union really felt like this was a turning point in the war. Now the Federals controlled the Mississippi River and split the South in half, so they didn't have the same supply lines. One of the things that I thought was very intriguing, and it had to be horrifying for the families, is that with the Union Navy on the river and the town being surrounded by Union troops, the town was in complete and utter bombardment all the time. And that little display you saw there was an example of the families would dig caves into the side of the hills to protect them and their families from all of the artillery that was going off pretty much 24/7. There were 77,000 Union troops versus 33,000 Confederates. Near the end of the siege, the Confederate troops had pretty much taken all meat and vegetables from all the citizens and were scrounging quite a lot for food, and even then they were still being rationed to quite small amounts of food. A day or two before the actual surrender, General Pemberton and General Grant met in between the lines, and at that time General Grant wanted a complete and utter surrender, and Pemberton didn't agree with that. So a day or two later, Grant agreed to give paroles to the Union or the Confederate soldiers so they could go home. And with that agreement, they were able to bring about the surrender July 4th. Over 29,000 Confederate soldiers surrendered at that time. I think the Civil War really brought a lot of things to life that historians can look at these old pictures. It was one of the first times that war was photographed so heavily. And it's just amazing to see the old pictures that show these old residences and other buildings in the condition they were in during the war, and how either side would dig entrenchments and other protective earthworks around these buildings during the war, and how you can still see some of the misshapen areas of the land just from that battle that occurred, 100+ years ago. And of course, like all the Civil War battlefields, there were monuments all over. This is one of the bigger, fancier monuments on site here. It's definitely quite a feeling to be standing at these monuments, knowing what they represent, and just getting that idea of what these people went through during these really, really tough times in our country's history. Know that civilians were digging holes in the side of hills just to protect themselves from the constant artillery, and that tens of thousands of people were being extremely rationed on what they could eat every day because of the onslaught, and that all their supply lines had been cut off. And this was another spot where the Union dug a tunnel up underneath the Confederate lines and put over 2,000 pounds of black powder in and exploded it to try to bring an end to it. The Confederates were able to fight back and hold the lines, even with that much destruction going on. It is definitely a humbling experience to go to these sites and see firsthand where this stuff took place, knowing what took place. And you go to these locations and it's just mind-numbing how many graves are there for both sides, and how many of those were unidentified, so they're just the simple square markers with a 4-digit number on it. Just crazy that our country went through that time and went through all these heartaches. I'm thankful we've managed to heal for the most part, and that we are one nation, and we are where we are because of what happened in our history. We may not like what happened in our history, but it is what shaped us, and we shouldn't forget what happened, because we don't want to make those same mistakes again. It really is an eye-opener to go to these places and see the terrain and see the evidence of these actions taken by both sides, and it's quite an experience. And I don't know how many of you folks out there have seen it, but there's a movie called Hawps, and it's a story about the Army trying out the use of camels in the military. It's a funny movie. It's a good comedy if you want to see one. And Old Douglas was one of the camels tested by the military. Douglas actually served for the Confederate States, and that is his burial spot. And then this is the USS Cairo. It was a lead ship of the City class of gunboats. It was named for Cairo, Illinois. In June 1862, this ship helped capture the Confederate garrison of Fort Pillow on the Mississippi. This enabled the Union to occupy Memphis. This is just one of many ironclad gunboats that were made by both sides. On December 12, 1862, while clearing mines in the area, she was hit and sunk by a torpedo. And we think a torpedo being a missile being fired through the water. Back in these days, a torpedo was basically a bomb kept underwater, kind of like a mine. We call it a mine today. And this one was remotely detonated by Confederate soldiers on the bank watching the area. And they successfully sank the Cairo. The fortunate thing is there was no loss of life in that sinking. You can still see in the old timbers when you walk around here, you can see the damage caused by the mine, which blew me away. And it was amazing how much of that original wood, the original wheel for the operating system, those were still there. The engines were still there. They were dismantled and cleaned and put back together. But it's amazing how much of the ship was actually kept intact when it sank in the really thick, deep mud of the river. It basically closed off all oxygen and preserved things quite well. It was amazing walking around how much of the original ship was still there. And it just blew my mind that they have this set up so you can walk around it. You can see the stern wheels in the back here, and you can see the rudders that would steer the ship. And even though a lot of the other parts have rotted away, they built a basic framework to show you what the ship would have been like, completely intact. The ship was actually found in 1956 in the Yazoo River where it sank. It wasn't raised until 1964. It wasn't too long after it was raised that it was moved here to the Vicksburg battlefield area and then turned over to the National Park Service. The museum right next to it has so many artifacts. It's just amazing. That's the original ship's bell. But as they went through the mud and muck that was covering this ship, they uncovered so many artifacts. Because this thing was hit by a torpedo, and if I remember correctly, it only took like 15 minutes for it to sink. Nobody had time to return to their quarters and get personal belongings or to retrieve firearms or anything. So all this stuff you see was found in the mud and muck inside the ship. And after it was cleaned up, it's amazing the condition some of this stuff is in. Pretty much everything you see in these cases were recovered from the ship when they brought it up from the bottom of the river. Just amazing how much was still intact. And this cannon is believed to have been split in two from the explosion of the torpedo that sunk the ship. Just think about the power needed to break a cannon like that in two. It's also amazing how often they could find old records from when the ship was built and have so many detailed drawings of what it was like from the blueprints alone. And this is actually an original howitzer that would have likely been on the deck of a ship. I don't believe that one was directly from the Cairo, but from that era. And that's the original carriage, which is quite impressive. I was still taken aback by all the items that they had found and cleaned up and what good condition they were in. Just amazing. The Cairo is believed to be one of only 4 Civil War ironclads in existence. It's by far the most complete. I believe one of them they have just managed to get the pilot house, and the rest of it still at the bottom of the ocean off of Charleston. And 2 others, I believe, have been recovered, and some of the original wooden framework was there, but this, to me, from my research, this was by far the most complete. Good times.